The question that is appearing to occupy more newsprint than wallpaper at the moment is the issue of housing. I continually get myself in trouble by saying to people that our housing crisis is completely normal. Every country in Europe has equivalent issues in terms of affordability, in terms of homelessness, in terms of the appropriateness of the mix. One of our tragedies of living on an island is that we are people who indulge in what we call insular thinking. We have to remind ourselves the word insular thinking means people who live on an island. I shocked myself recently by looking at the homelessness ratio of all of the countries of the EU and was very surprised to discover that Ireland's ratio of homeless people per head of population is in fact one of the lowest in Europe, and that countries like Germany and France and our near neighbours in Britain have 3 times the level that we do. When we forget that at our peril, because it causes us to move away from those things that we succeed at doing so well, such as creating a country that has managed to survive one of the most extraordinarily economic declines that has been experienced by any Western democracy. So as we dwell upon those things and as we go into the topics today, I'd like you all to think about the fact that we are people who can do, and we have evidence of that because we have done. We are at the end of a classic 5-year period which occurs at the end of a housing crash. The first 2 years are stopping to work out has the actual building finished collapsing around us. And then there's a classic 3-year period after that when people assemble sites and finance and get permissions and start things going. So we're exactly at year 4.5 of that 5-year period. And year 4.5 is always characterised by the sense that there will never be any more houses. This is the period when governments panic. This is the period when policymakers panic. And this is the period when plans are put in place that will produce the next downward cycle, because the seeds of the end of every economic housing cycle begin now. The thing that causes oversupply begins right now. The financial incentives, the loosening of credit terms, the expansion of planning capacity happens right now at year 4.5. And I'd say most of the people who can do anything about preventing the next housing bubble are in this room at the moment. And what we're trying to say to all of you, what we in the agency are saying to the government, what we in the agency are saying to any minister we can lay our hands on, is enough of the initiatives. Just let us get on with the recovery in an orderly way. All of the seeds of that are in place. Rebuilding Ireland is in place. It is working. And we are going to see dramatically more houses finished in the next 12 months than we've seen in the previous, and more thereafter. I'm still waiting for one more guest. So what I'm minded to do, he said, looking at Marian, is... Were you there? Owen, sorry, I beg your pardon. Is begin. So would you like to join us as well, Owen? Sorry. Is that we'll begin, and we will. We've had the introductions already in terms of qualifications and backgrounds. So to try and keep us to time, I've asked each of the speakers to try to stay to the 15 minutes allotted, and I'm going to be equally harsh with you afterwards with questions and ask you to demonstrate to all of us in the room that you have the professionalism to ask a question without making a statement. Think about that, Dermot. So, John, you ready?
I'll ask you agree with
Yep. You ready to start? Okay. Our manager, Owen Keegan.
I'm delighted to have this opportunity to address the conference on the issue of residential development in Dublin City. I think there can be no doubt that housing is the major challenge facing the Dublin region. The immediate concern is the failure of housing supply, with the interesting exception of student accommodation, to respond to the very obvious increase in housing demand. And while there are very clear and welcome signs of recovery in housing output in the Dublin region, the level of activity is still well below that required to meet demand. The adverse consequences of a non-performing housing market are fairly obvious, but 2 particular concerns. One is the potential this has to put a significant brake on the economic growth of the Dublin region. And of greater and indeed more immediate concern is the unprecedented number of households presenting as homeless in the region, both single person and family households. And I think it's very difficult to comprehend the sheer human misery behind the homeless and rough sleeping statistics. I mean, last night, for example, we would have accommodated about 3,000 individuals between families and individuals, over 3,000 in emergency accommodation, which is simply unprecedented. But it indicates the scale of the challenge we face. Now, Dublin City Council is not responsible for the performance of the private housing market. However, we do have an important influencing role, particularly in the area of land use planning and development, in the provision of homeless services, and I suppose how we use our own land. While I don't want to enter a very political debate, and I am speaking in personal capacity, I hope I can offer some perspectives on the housing market in the region. What I want to do, I want to begin by just a few comments on the very complex nature of the housing problem, say a few words on the case for private rented tenure, talk about development levies, the recently adopted city development plan, look at the area of land use zonings, and then the case for increased height and density. In my opinion, there is insufficient appreciation of the very complex nature of the problems that we face in the area of housing. And Ireland is not unique in this regard. And I'm often drawn to the work of the design theorists Rittel and Weber, who back in 1973 first coined the term wicked to describe problems, predominantly in the area of social policy, which present very significant challenges. And I just think the Australian Public Service Commission kind of outlined the characteristics of these problems. And if you have a look at them up there, I think it's very clear that the problems in the Dublin housing market share most, if not all, of the characteristics of a classic wicked problem. I think the issue of housing affordability illustrates the complexity of the problem and the existence of conflicting perspectives. Most homeowners, including those with mortgages, will accept that the rapidly rising house prices are making housing less affordable for a whole new generation of prospective purchasers. They may even accept that this is not a positive development. However, they are also conscious of the fact that they are benefiting from the wealth effects of real house price inflation. Existing homeowners, in my experience, are unlikely to support measures that will reduce the cost of housing, especially more supportive land use policies, and that's a topic I'll return to later. The complicating factor here is that housing, in addition to providing accommodation, is also the primary means of wealth acquisition and transfer among Irish households. Another complicating factor is that there's no single national housing market in Ireland. The housing problems in Dublin are different in both scale and nature from housing problems in other urban areas and indeed in rural areas. Government policy needs to recognise the reality with interventions targeted specifically at the Dublin market. A one-size-fits-all approach simply isn't good enough. Another implication of a complex problem is that it provides opportunities for spectacular failure if the interventions are inappropriate. And I've just set out there just the historic data on new house completions in Dublin going back to 1970. And it really is in the gold medal territory for spectacular mismanagement of a very vital market. While it was very volatile between 1970 and 2000, what happened between 2000 and 2007 and the subsequent crash was just extraordinary. The state and individual citizens have paid and continue to pay a very high price for this volatility. Given the scale of the crash and its impact on the house building sector, it was always inevitable that the recovery in the sector would lag behind the recovery in demand. And I suppose I want to echo something that Conor has said. I mean, the sense of national urgency and political engagement around the housing crisis is to be welcomed. However, it has also created conditions which have encouraged populist and simplistic solutions to what are very complex problems. Given the complex nature of the problem and the pressures to be seen to be doing something to address the current crisis, there is a real risk that poorly thought out, short-sighted and potentially counterproductive interventions focused on the shorter term will be implemented, which will only compound the problems in the sector in the longer term. And on just one bright note, I do believe that the establishment of the Department of Housing represents a potentially significant development. If properly resourced, it may in time develop a much better and much needed understanding of the operation of the Dublin housing market. It may also ensure a more consistent set of policy interventions and be in a position to insist that government gives a higher priority to the achievement of housing policy objectives, if necessary, and it may well be necessary, at the expense of other government objectives. I want to say a few words about private rented. A feature of the Irish housing market is the continuing enthusiasm for owner occupation even as the share of rented tenure increases. I find this quite surprising, because given the negative experience of house purchasers during the boom, who are now saddled with, in many cases, significant negative equity and unaffordable mortgages, but that enthusiasm for owner occupation still persists. And owner occupation has generally been encouraged by the state through various interventions, including the policy of offering ever more generous incentives to local authority tenants to become homeowners, thereby reducing social housing stock at a time of unprecedented, unmet demand for social housing. Notwithstanding certain advantages of owner occupation, I certainly believe that policy should be tenure neutral. But I would go beyond that. In the case of Dublin City, I think actually the state should favour renting. The evidence suggests that renting facilitates a greater flexibility in meeting housing need, supports a more mobile workforce, and ensures a more efficient utilisation of the available housing stock, which in turn reduces the cost of accommodation both to society and to the individual. And I think it's worth pointing out that 23% of the households in Dublin City now reside in private renting, and that's up from 16% a decade ago. And one implication of the central bank's macroprudential lending rules and of the increasing divergence between house price inflation and income growth is that households who previously aspired to owner occupation may not be able to realise that ambition, and they will be forced to rent. And I think it's important that those households who are already living in rented accommodation and those who will have no choice but to live in rented accommodation in the future are not made to feel that they are in an inferior form of tenure. And in this regard, I actually think that the build-to-rent model offers a very exciting and welcome development. And I've set out there some of the advantages. Notwithstanding the political and public enthusiasm for owner occupation, we should recognise that renting is likely to continue to grow, and that this form of tenure offers many advantages. And I think there's a case for state intervention to recognising that and support that sector. Now, I just want to say a few words about development levies. And this is in the context of an argument that because development levies contribute to the cost of housing, we're contributing to making housing unaffordable, and that we should reduce our levies to address affordability and, I presume, improve the margins in the sector. I've set out in this slide the trend in levies that we charge on new residential development, new housing development, going back to 2004. And the reality is that the actual levy per metre squared on new residential development, it's been halved since 2010. Now, half of that is because we no longer levy in respect of water services, but the other half was an incentive to the sector. So I'm very happy that we've played our bit in contributing to housing affordability, and we won't be reducing our levies any further. I want to move on now to the city development plan. There's a lot of criticism at the planning system. Some of it may well be merited, but I think it is important to recognise that the elected members, and incidentally the elected members, not the planners or the chief executive, make planning policy, and that's entirely appropriate. But in the 2016 to 2022 development plan, a whole series of measures were adopted as part of that plan to remove constraints in the previous plan and to facilitate new housing development. And I've set out the major ones there, but a lot more land was zoned for residential. All areas, effectively all areas, have been redesignated as regeneration areas, so they're now within the scope of the vacant sites levy. The mixed-use zoning Z10, the amount of permitted residential development was increased in that. Provision is made for a reduction or elimination in car parking requirements in the city centre area, where there's access to good public transport. And developers who avail of that, and a number of developers can either eliminate or greatly reduce the need for underground car parking. Extra height is permitted in the city centre area and at rail hubs. We've obviously incorporated the department's guidelines on reduced apartment sizes. There's a lot of measures to support the build-to-rent model. The limit on one-bedroom units was increased from 20% to 30%. The proportion of dual-aspect units was reduced from 85% to 50%, and east-facing single-aspect units, which were previously not permitted, were allowed. So I just think it's important, in fairness to the council and to the elected members, that there has been significant effort to address what we're seeing as real constraints on the development of housing. Another criticism of the council is that our land use policies are unduly restrictive and don't facilitate housing. I just took out all the different zonings, and the net reality is that about 70% of the land use zonings facilitate housing. About 50% of the land is mainly pure housing. Of the 3 zonings that don't facilitate housing, the major one, which is about 26%, is amenity open space land. Now, I believe there is a case for revisiting the 26% of zoned land that is currently zoned amenity open space. Quality open space is an essential component of a healthy, sustainable city. However, there are too many examples of amenity open space land in the city council area that, quite frankly, do not offer any significant amenity value. The public interest would be best served, in my opinion, by allowing residential development on some of these sites in return for investing in improving recreational amenities on the balance of the site. That's just something, I'm not sure how popular that would be, but certainly a view I would have. So I want to move on, I suppose, to the really critical area of height and density. The new city development plan provides for a target of about 25,000 residential units to be provided over the 6-year life of the plan. And there's more than sufficient suitably zoned service land to facilitate the delivery of this housing, provided we achieve reasonable densities and the land is actually brought into use. However, I personally believe that the city can and should make a far greater contribution to meeting current and expected housing demand in the Dublin region, while at the same time it has potential to reduce the cost of housing and help create more compact, vibrant and connected city which people want to live in and experience. And it can do this by reviewing its currently restrictive approach to height and density. Now, in fairness, I suppose, to our elected members, I'm very conscious that Dermot is here, they have embraced the need for higher density in the new undeveloped areas of the city. And that's particularly evidenced in the recently adopted Poolbeg West SDZ, which provides for residential heights from 4 to 20 stories and a density of approximately 300 units per hectare. However, facilitating higher densities in established areas of the city represents a real challenge for elected members, given the lack of public support in these areas. I just put up this, I always admire this chart. It shows the permitted heights. If we had time, we might just look in awe at the prescriptive nature of this. It always strikes me that the command economy is alive and well in the planning system. The difficulty, I mean, even superficially in the outer city, we do permit developments, residential developments of up to 5 stories. But the requirement to have regard to the prevailing local height and context is especially problematic, as it militates against higher density development in 2-story housing areas, which are especially prevalent. And I suppose the background to this is that the vision for the city, oh, that's gone. Yeah, the vision for the city, and it's set out in the development plan, essentially commits the city to being a low-rise city with 1 or 2 notable exceptions. And this emphasis on a low-rise city in the development plan, it reflects, I suppose, 2 main concerns. One, the need to retain and protect the Georgian and Victorian character of the historic central area. And secondly, the desire to protect 2-story housing areas which prevail in both the inner and the outer suburbs. And indeed extend into the city core to a large degree. While these are legitimate considerations, they must be balanced against the arguments for higher residential densities, which, with an inevitable increase in height, higher densities are consistent with the general trend towards smaller household sizes. They reduce unit costs and promote more affordable housing. They facilitate more sustainable development. They respond to the scarcity of development land in the city, and they facilitate a more compact city with a quality living environment. And it seems to me that the 5-story cap on residential development covers a very significant area of the city between the canals and the M50. And this is where I believe, actually, there's very significant potential for higher residential densities. The consequence of the current policy on low-rise outer city is that areas that are large enough to define their own character are forced to adopt a low profile with a distinct lack of variety and excessive site coverage. So it seems to me that there are kind of 4 things we probably need to do. One, we need to adopt a new city vision that drops the commitment to a low-rise city, while protecting, I think, the historic city core. We need to facilitate much higher development along our major transport corridors. We need to consolidate our key district centres by allowing much, much higher development in those, higher density and higher development in those centres. And essentially any site that's over 0.5 of a hectare should be, I suppose, to some extent exempt from this prescriptive form. It should be allowed to define its own character. I suppose this is coming on to the crunch. There are a few areas in public policy where the lack of intergenerational solidarity is more obvious than the public attitude to higher density residential development. While very significant progress has been made in generating public support for measures to promote sustainable travel modes, progress in selling the virtues and indeed necessity for higher density residential development has been much slower. A significant number of residents and resident associations in low-rise areas of the city object to even medium-rise development on the grounds that it will place unbearable pressure on local services and devalue their homes. And as far as they are concerned, I mean, we get it all the time. Anything above 2 stories is just, wait for it, bad planning, and it must be stopped at all costs. Now, in my view, policy in relation to height and density should ideally continue to be made by elected members like Dermot. I'd asked Dermot he should concentrate on this area, right? As part of a development plan process. And this is required because we need to have a degree of democratic legitimacy. We need to give, I believe, a degree of certainty to developers and to residents. But a mechanism must be found where the interests of both existing residents and prospective residents are brought to bear on the decision-making process. Thank you.
Good morning. As you can hear, my throat is in a state of chassis. So forgive me for this, I'll bear through. I mean, 15 minutes isn't very long, is it? Okay, I wanted to talk about this whole notion of what is a vital city. We've been fighting a bit of a battle in the UK. Consecutive governments have decided that actually this thing called a garden city is a great idea. This notion of building new villages, new towns outside of main conurbations is a great idea. But we're not sure they know what the hell they're talking about. Let's go back to Ebenezer Howard. He knew what a garden city was about. His 3 main points were all about the mixture of the uses. So residential, work, agriculture at that time was very important. He also talked about sustainability, i.e. you had to get enough employment into these places so that they actually became places where people worked and lived at the same time. But also importantly, he had a social aspect, which was about community ownership, where land values actually stayed within the community and helped to invigor and enrich the community over time as land values increased. So that's a proper garden city. I kind of think this is what governments are thinking about, what garden cities are really about. Now, call it garden city, call it urban extensions, call it new towns. This is from The Truman Show, and if you know the film, you'll know exactly what happened. Not a good result. So, are garden cities appropriate? They certainly use more car transport rather than public. They're less inclusive. They tend to be very much asocial. There's very little shopping and entertainment involved. And generally, they become quite lifeless. They seem to lose their sense of purpose in society. And a great statistic is that new towns generally have far more cars. 70% of people traveling to work from new towns use a car. 63% is the UK average, and in London it's 31%. So, are garden cities enough? So if we built just garden cities in the UK, what would be the issue? So we'd need 4.8 million new homes. Taking Letchworth as an example, Letchworth was built just before the war, actually. Population about 30-odd thousand. We would need 20 garden cities, of which 400 would be required by 2037, which is an area of just over 8,000 square kilometres, which if you put it on the map of the UK, kind of joins up London to Birmingham. Who needs HS2? So there you go, Garden City, beautiful. It looks like North America in a funny sort of way. Right, so what makes a dense city vital? So what's the contrary to that? What is it that actually we should be doing? What is it that Dublin should be doing? It's people. Let's be bloody obvious. It's all about people. It's us. We are the collateral that make a place great. We're a social animal. We want to talk to each other. We want to just get on with each other, doing stuff. And the more people you've got that, the more opportunities you have of doing that stuff that you want to do. It's quality, not size. So it doesn't matter if you've got thousands of people in one place. If the quality is not there, that place will fail. That uniqueness, that notion, I mentioned London there. Organic growth. We build upon the histories of our place. Designing inorganic cities, this talks about time. If you design a city very quickly, like a garden city, that sense of place isn't there. You have to force it in there somehow. But if you let it grow and embed it in a city like Dublin, you have the history, the culture, the placemaking, which enriches that development, that you add to it. The layers of history, the layers of change, the richness of placemaking is what densification can help you with. And you also have these ingredients, which, putting lots of people together, you get all this stuff for free. You don't have to make it up. You don't have to bring it in and ship it in and pay for it. You've already got it. And the green thing, well, people say, well, if it goes really dense, we can't get any green stuff. Well, that's absolute rubbish. You can design green stuff at all levels, at all scales, and you can experience it in different ways, not just as a big park, but just on your balcony. That's a green place. And the idea of things changing as time moves on, that sense of social change is important to keep a city vital. And I, as an architect, need to make sure that I design buildings that are adaptable, that are not there for 20 years and get then kicked away. And what this whole richness of place gives you, this density, is the sense of character, this sense of identity, the sense of brand even. Dare I say it, dare I use that awful word, but brand is a part of what it is that we sell ourselves with. It's the cool place factor. Not one thing fits all. I think different cities have different characters, different sorts of feelings. We should allow them to have that. We should work with our communities, the different sorts of communities, not just by where you come from, but are you a commercial community, a pedagogical community? Are you a university? And are you a social community? What stuff do you do in the evenings during the lunch breaks? And also these communities, they are more competitive, generally speaking, in denser spaces. And certainly more flexible and certainly more adaptable. So key to the success, and the big word for me is this word here, exchange. Exchange of information is what makes cities successful. These are whole regions, whole exercises of exchange. But at the end of the day, I want something, I want to give it to you, you need it. Where's the place to do that in a dense city? So a quick case study. I've worked on this project for years. It's now on site. It's the Elephant and Castle in central London, Zone 1. 9 hectares of this, which has now been knocked down. And it was disconnected completely. This is the Elephant Haygate estate. And our proposal was very much to connect it back together to the rest of its place, to give it a sense of its own identity back as part of this area. And what we've designed are a set of spaces, so big green park, smaller little squares, boulevarded streets, green areas at high level. And we've also made sure that we understood the typology of the place. Now, this might look a bit peculiar, but we're quite interested in this notion of the tripartite urban block. The idea that you can have a tall, a medium, and a low building composed not just for urban reasons, but also for commercial reasons. Somebody's going to want to buy this. Someone's going to buy that. Someone's going to buy that. Or someone's going to want to rent that, or rent that. Whatever it is, there is a social opportunity and a commercial opportunity in this diversity of block design. Perhaps a bit too dense for Dublin just now, but it makes the point that the tall, the medium, and the high in a composition can work very, very well. And it results in what is a real destination, a real place, somewhere where people are going to want to work and live and go to shop. So 7 ways to enable vital cities. First, densify existing cities. Do not expand them. Protect the greenbelt, in the UK particularly. Unblock brownfield land. And there's brownfield in greenbelt, which is also places that one can work with. Better empower decision makers. So we need people in authority to be given the opportunity to get things moving. Relax change of use classes. I say with caution because it can be used badly. But I think it's a great opportunity to get things moving quicker. And give people that live locally a stake. You have to consult, it's important. And I even suggested create a commission of urban density. So you get a group of people who actually can talk about it, who know what they're talking about. Now, very quickly, an Irish perspective. Now, sorry if I've got all this wrong. I've come in from London and I've just had a quick breeze through some thinking. Now, a couple of quotes, which I thought were very, very relevant. So both your Taoiseach and your Minister of Housing are telling me, hey, these urban sprawl things are just not working, guys. And there's an issue. Is that real? It's not cool. So, in the same way as I've managed to explain for the UK, Ireland needs, and this is taken from National Planning Framework, this is the draft. Okay, it's 23 years, I think you mentioned, but we're almost to the end of this year. So by 2040, that's 22. We need approximately that many homes. That's 25,000 a year. That's the size of Galway, more or less, every single year. Now there's your bit of green land. Just bang. Let's do those semi-detached houses, guys. So, is it not time to build? It's time to stop building on Greenbelt. So, some considerations to finish. It'd be great for national planning frameworks started to talk about densification and encourage it. It'd be great if you had a tall building strategy. I think the city needs to become more metropolitan. But very careful. Density is not necessarily driven by height alone. I think it's good design is more important than height. There are densest parts of London which are not high. So there we are. Design standards. I would say this, but densities can be increased without relaxing housing design standards. We need to give people houses that are homes fit for them to live in. And I would explore the opportunities of, obviously, PRS and co-living models, which this is something we did, which we think is very exciting, whereby you make a social space, a place where communities are actually brought together, not just young people coming out of universities, but also people towards the other side of their lives, where they've got rid of the kids, they want a smaller place, but they don't want to live in a 55-plus place where it's all the same people. PRS and co-living can give you that opportunity. Big data harvesting, we talked about this earlier, and the role of the citywide digital planning model. I mean, in London now we're using digital planning models to check things before they go to planning. So we can place our ideas in, we can check it to see it's not in the view corridor of St. Paul's, for example. I think Dublin should have that for its own purposes. And all associated models that have clearly been discussed earlier. The City of London has a fantastic opportunity at the moment of putting exactly something like this in place. And finally, really, just to say, insist upon minimum as well as maximum densities. So if you've got a planning application going in and it's just 2-story, you can insist upon it being 4-story or 6-story or whatever it needs to be. On that note, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Marian Finnegan. I head up the research function for Cushman and Wakefield. What I'm hoping to do today is talk to you a little bit on the theme that we're on this morning, on demographic trends and how that's impacting the property market cycle in particular and impacting the development of our cities. And I think clearly when we look across our economy and the developments of our economy over the last number of years, there are a lot of factors that have driven the property market. I mean, if you think about it, property market is a function of the people's need for accommodation, so that's just not for residential accommodations, for commercial accommodation, places to live and places to work and places to eat and places to socialise. It's a function of how our economy is performing, and we know how bad that impacted the property market during the crisis years. And as the economy has recovered, it has brought with it a new demand for accommodation right the way across the country. And it's also about the political environment in which we're operating in. And I think even though we've had a few challenges in the last week with some of the political changes that have been made, I think we would agree that the political environment is positive towards the development of the property market. What I want to do today is talk a little bit more on those topics and think about how they're influencing the need for accommodation in Ireland. So if we start with the economic environment, we have a very, very positive economic environment. Over the last couple of years in particular, we've seen growth rates in Ireland that have us outperforming every one of our competitors in terms of the Eurozone. Our projected growth levels are very strong. Our consumer spending is improving. Our labour market conditions have improved. We have over 200,000 more people employed today than we had at the height of the recession. All of these people require somewhere to live and somewhere to work, and that's driving a huge need for accommodation across our country, some of which is being dealt with very effectively and some of which has not been dealt with. But if you look at that chart, we're now at an unemployment level of 6.2%, which means we're rapidly approaching full employment, which means that if we're going to grow in the future, we are going to need more and more people to decide to come and live here and to come and work here from abroad or come back for those that have left if we're going to maintain our level of productivity. And that means we're going to require more and more accommodation for those people. But population change and the demands of a population aren't new and they're not unique to Ireland by any means. And certainly it's much easier to plan for an economy which is somewhat stagnant in terms of its population. If your population is gradually ageing, you can pretty much predict what it's going to look like in 5 or 10 years' time. A population like ours, which is young and dynamic and growing largely as a function of migration, are very hard to predict for us, and we have to get better at doing it. If you think about the world in 1950, 2.6 billion people lived in the world in 1950. 55% of them lived in Asia. 22%, or about 500 million people, lived in Europe. Move on to 2050, we'll have about 9.6 billion people living in the world, and only 6% of them will live in Europe, which is pretty much the same population that it would have had in 1950. Which is why, if you think about it, within Europe, we have a lot of stagnant population centres. Growth areas like Ireland and the UK are critically important in terms of the development of that European zone. In fact, the biggest growth centre is going to be Africa, which will represent 39% of the population of the world by 2050. And that's going to see significant changes to how we work and how we live and how our economy evolves. And that 2.4 billion extra people will all need to be accommodated in cities. And yet today, we think about the biggest cities in the world often with the mindset of a person who lived in 1950, although we didn't all live in 1950. But we think about the biggest cities as being in the USA, being America, Tokyo, London, Paris. But by 2050, the biggest cities in the world are going to be Mumbai, Delhi, Dhaka, Calcutta. They're not cities that we think of today in terms of big global needs or big urban needs or property needs, but this is the future. We need to start moving quickly towards thinking about this evolution of our world and how we're going to accommodate people. But it's not just in the rest of the world. In 1950, there were less than 3 million people living in Ireland. Today, 4.7 million. By 2031, there's going to be 5.5 million people. In 1950, there was about 600,000 people in Dublin, 1.35 million people living here. Rapidly growing city, about 1.5 million people will be living here by 2031. We need to accommodate those people, and we need to do it effectively. And the discussion this morning is all around that. But it's more than just residential space or housing space. Obviously, these people need somewhere to live. But arguably, the commercial market has addressed that. There's over 400,000 square metres of office space under construction in our 4 urban centres. We're providing the office space. We're doing what's right in terms of the accommodation need. Retail accommodation is changing. We are going to look at how we adapt to that. There has been some adaptations, but certainly we're going to need to be much more creative in terms of the use of our retail space going forward. Internationally, logistic and industrial space has completely evolved. In Ireland, it's like the 1950s. 50% of our space is below grade A standard, and of that 50% that is, or less than 50% that is grade A standard, most of it is less than 1,000 metres in size. So we have a really old 1950 size industrial market that needs rapid change. We certainly need, if we're going to grow at the pace we're growing, much more accommodation in terms of schools and hospitals. Our hotel market has improved significantly in recent years. We need to keep focus on that. But if you look at the one area that we haven't got right as the recovery occurred, it's in around the residential sector. But arguably, and I'm going to talk a little bit more on this in a moment, it's probably the private rental sector that we definitely haven't gotten right in terms of the recession, the recovery, and how our economy and population will change in the future. We know, and it's been mentioned a little bit this morning, and there's some debate around the different levels of figures, but we know we should be building a lot more units than we are building. The current requirement, by my analysis, we should be building at the moment, today in Ireland, 38,000 units every year. If we don't do that this year, which we won't, that means next year we need to be building 40,000 units. Last year we built about 15, we might get to 18 this year. So we're well behind the curve in terms of what the market really needs. And of the stock we are building, half of the stock is one-off housing, scattered, which is why we have that low density of population all over the country. We're building a handful of social housing, a few hundred social houses every year, which is why we have a growing crisis in terms of homelessness. And we're only building a few thousand units that we're supplying into the marketplace every year for people to buy, to live in, or for investors to buy, to rent out. And that is way less than the market requirement that we really need. Yet, despite that, funnily enough, because of other regulatory changes, we have our capital market, our owner-occupied market, into some control. So this is the cycle of the Irish housing market from its evolution in the improving economy in the late 1990s to the peak of the market in 2006, all the way through the crash and to the recovery since then. House prices in Ireland have grown by about 50% from their crash. But still today, in all of our urban centres, the value that you would spend or the cost that you would spend to buy a house is 30 to 35% less than you would have done a year ago. So despite the fact that we're not building houses, despite the fact that our population has grown very dramatically, if you want to buy a house in Ireland today, it is much less expensive to do so than it was a decade ago. So that's not a bad result. We're not perfect, but it's not a bad result. And certainly we need to get the expansion of the delivery of stock much more rapidly than we have done. But as was said earlier, Rebuilding Ireland is doing a good job and we are beginning to see greater levels of expansion. But if we look a little bit more at where the biggest crisis is, if you want to rent a property in Ireland today, you will pay between 11 and 15% more than you did at the height of the Celtic Tiger. Now that's mismanagement, that is a mistake. We've done something seriously wrong. And if you think back to my earlier slide where I said if we want this economy to continue to grow, we need to encourage more migrants back into Ireland. What's the first thing you do when you move to a new country? You rent first. It would be a challenge for us to facilitate people at the scale that we will need. If you look at what I've done here is that the middle part of the graph there is the total stock of private rental accommodation that exists in our country by the different cities. And just a couple of weeks ago, we looked at what was available to rent in each one of those cities on Daft. And I know the whole world isn't on Daft, but a lot of the properties available to rent are on Daft. If you wanted to rent a property in Dublin in the last couple of weeks, there was 1,000 units available in all of the city to rent from. If you wanted to rent in Galway, where I'm from, 143 units to rent. If you wanted to rent in Limerick, 84 units. In Cork, less than 300 units. All of those figures that I've called out represent less than 1% of the private housing stock. Now that is, again, a huge issue for a market that requires an increased level of rental stock. Look at the Dublin market overall. If you wanted to rent in Dublin too, you had a choice of 86 units. Think of the Google land for what that is. Think of the central business district and the huge demand that we have for office accommodation. We're worried, are we building enough office accommodation to prevent a spiralling rent? But if you want to work in one of those offices, you have a choice of 86 units in which you could rent from. And they were probably all gone after the first day. Looking beyond that a little bit, at the type of units, of the 1,000 units, for example, available to rent in Dublin, there was about 300 or 340 houses. So if we're trying to encourage families, and if you think in a post-Brexit environment, we're saying what we're hoping will happen is that families will come, move from London, move to Ireland. We have a huge challenge. Again, of the 140 so in Galway, about 37% of them were apartments, about 60% houses. Really small numbers for us to be positioning ourselves as a competitive, attractive environment. Now, into this mix, we have changed our legislation in recent years, and that has been progressive. So we're now encouraging the professionalisation of the investment sector. We're encouraging REITs to invest in the marketplace. We're encouraging multifamily development. We're encouraging multifamily investment with a little bit of success. And this is the level of investment. If you look at any investment in the sector north of €1 million over the last 4 years, how much investment has occurred? Typically about 420 million every year. So modest enough levels of investment. If you look at it in absolute numbers, between 19 and 1,700 again units purchased every year. So that's the level of transaction activity. But if we think back to 10 or 15 years ago, back before this legislation was brought in, the private rental sector in Ireland was supplied by private investors. What has happened in the intervening period is because of the crash, we put a heavy tax imposition on those private investors. So we've seen a significant exodus of private investors from the marketplace. We hoped to replace them by professionalising the sector, but that hasn't happened as of yet. So we're at this impasse in the marketplace where we have a totally inadequate supply of stock and we have a growing need. So that has impacted the affordability of renting in Ireland. Now, how affordable is the Irish marketplace? If you take a typical rule of thumb and you say no household should spend more than 30% of their disposable income on accommodation, so that is whether your mortgage or your rental accommodation. This is a look at over the last decade for Ireland overall, not for Dublin, and the green line is your 30%. So right the way through the boom and the recession, we have consistently spent well more than 30% of our disposable income on average on rental accommodation. Currently, the average figure for Ireland is 41%. If you look at it across our cities, a little bit more significant. If you're renting in Dublin today, the average household is spending 55% of their disposable income on rental accommodation. So well above what we would consider an affordable city. And certainly it's a lot cheaper now to buy, if you could find somewhere, than it is to rent with those type of figures. And for the other regional centres, Cork, Limerick and Galway, figures from 30 to 37% across those cities. But when you delve into it a little bit more and look at the actual cities of Galway City, Limerick City and Cork City, you can see much higher figures emerging. All of the cities are spending between 40 and 50%, or that's how much an individual would spend on rental accommodation. So we have become an incredibly expensive location for somebody to rent in, which is the first thing you do when you move into the property market. And that is something that I think that needs immediate address. Again, looking at that division over different property types, housing is incredibly expensive to rent in. So we can see the median cost of rental accommodation in Dublin, for example, was about $2,500 for a house, which is incredibly expensive across the board. And all of those cities were experiencing very high costs in terms of housing accommodation, in particular over apartment dwelling. Now, what I've done here is just look at the total stock of available properties to rent in Dublin as of this month by different price categories. 50% of the units available to rent would have cost the individual renting it more than €2,000 a month. 50% or more than €2,000 a month. So in other words, you would have to have a household income to make that affordable of disposable income of over 6,000 to make those units affordable. A quarter of the units available were over €3,000 a month, and less than 20% of the households' rental income available on the marketplace was less than $1,500. So there is a huge challenge for this market going forward. We need to provide affordable accommodation across the board, but particularly at the first point of entry, because as this market becomes increasingly unaffordable, we force more and more people into the social sector, and thereafter we force more and more people into homelessness. And although our figures are not as bad as other countries, they are growing rapidly, and this is part of the cycle. So in my view, looking in at the marketplace, I think this is the first part of that cycle that we have to get right. And until we get this element of the marketplace right, we are not providing an attractive city for people to come and live and work in. A lot of the other areas are functioning, but this certainly isn't as of yet. Ireland is new, relatively new, so therefore we can forgive ourselves a little bit to this whole rental sector. And if you think back to 2006, I think it was about 8.7% of our population at that time lived in what was determined as private rental accommodation or paying market rent in terms of their accommodation. Move on 5 years, and the proportion of the population living in rental accommodation in 2011 had doubled. We all know what that was about. Very strong levels of migration, very strong construction activity, and a great appetite. But even as we stand, the latest data is only from 2015, so ours will be slightly higher than this, slightly more current than this. But the average in the UK is that in the EU, is that about 20% of all populations would live in private rented accommodation. Our data is a little bit behind that. We're below 15%. But as we grow and evolve and become more cosmopolitan, and as we encourage more migrants to move back into Ireland, we'll expect that figure to grow. And even being really conservative, just getting ourselves to more like a European average, we would expect over the next 5 years that about 16.6% of our households will be living in private rented accommodation. That means we need to be delivering 6,500 units every year into our market overall to make that market competitive, or just to meet the level of demand that is there. And as of yet, as we saw earlier, we're not doing anything like that. So I would suggest that this is a critically important area for us to get right in terms of the entire property market, because it's the first point that we will see people as they come in. And if we want to develop a nice, competitive, attractive place to live in, the first thing we need to do is ensure that the type of accommodation that people require is supplied, and this will require political intervention. So the budget was a little bit disappointing. I won't make it a political statement that it hasn't addressed it, but I think all of us in the room need to be clear that this is the biggest crisis. We don't need to worry about our office accommodation. The commercial market will solve those problems. We do need to worry about having enough accommodation, affordable accommodation, for our people to live in. Thank you very much.